At the end of Book 1 of the Aeneid, you may remember that Aeneas, Achates, several other Trojan leaders are in the court of Dido, where they receive a favorable welcome. And later in the evening, Dido begins to ask Aeneas individual questions concerning about the Trojan War, its participants, the events in it, blah, blah, blah. They're all sort of discursive and disconnected questions. And then eventually, she decides that it would be better to hear the story from the beginning. So she tells him something to that effect. Imo age et a prima dic hospes origine nobis. Tell us from the first beginning. Note, however, that Aeneas does not tell the story from the beginning of the Trojan War. Rather, he tells the last day of Troy and then his subsequent wanderings. So he begins his story by mentioning this island, Tenedos. Now, Tenedos is off the coast of Asia Minor here. You might know that it is not very far from Troy. So the Greek ships... the Greeks construct the wooden horse, and they leave it as well as Sinon there on the plains outside of Troy, and they themselves sail off and they beach their ships on the other side of the island so that they would not be visible to Trojan scouts. In the morning, the Trojans awake and they see nothing out there on the beaches. All of the Greek camps are gone, and they're puzzled by this initially. They go outside the walls, they notice the horse, they don't know what to make of it, and you may remember that there's a line in which they marvel at these empty fields, which for so long they've been unable to really set eyes on because it's been nothing but a bloodbath out there. So they marvel at the horse, and the common people are undecided as to what to do with the horse. Some think it should be thrown into the sea, others think that it should be burned, and still others think that it should instead be brought into the city, located near the citadel as a sacred object. So at this point, Laucaon rushes from the citadel, and he tries to talk some sense into the Trojans and tells them that there is something wrong with the horse. Either it is some sort of siege weapon, or there are Greeks inside it, or there's some unknown peril laying in it. But whatever it is, the Trojans should not trust it. And then he delivers that memorable line about how he does not trust the Greeks, or he fears the Greeks, even when they're bearing gifts. At that point, he hurls his spear into the horse, where it sticks and nothing happens, right? So he, I think, had anticipated that there were indeed men hidden inside it, and that some of them would be wounded by it. By his spear, that is. But it sticks, it was totally ineffective, and then the action is interrupted by some Trojan scouts who had found, or some Trojan shepherds who had found this guy Sinon lurking among the bushes and the crags outside the walls. And so then Aeneas tells Dido in anticipation that if she pays attention to this story of Sinon, she can learn about the character of all Greeks from his perfidious dissimulation, right? That he's such a crafty rogue, just like Odysseus, and this is, in Aeneas's mind, characteristic of the Greeks more generally. In a sense, this reflects a Roman prejudice against the Greeks, that they were all crafty, cunning, sort of wily tricksters, as opposed to the plain-spoken, honest, and simple Romans. So Sinon is brought before Priam and he's questioned, and he tells Priam and the other Trojans that he had fallen afoul of Odysseus, after the death of Palamedes, who was Sinon's friend. You might remember that Palamedes and Odysseus had an old rivalry, and Odysseus framed Palamedes for treachery, at which point Palamedes was stoned to death. So Sinon says that ever since that moment, Odysseus has been trying to find a way to get him, and he claims that Odysseus bribed Calchas the seer to interpret an omen such that some Greek blood was needed to appease the wrath of Minerva, and that Greek blood was to be Sinon's, and he was going to be sacrificed, etc., etc. All right. In some sense, the Greeks want to believe this because it involves a certain character defamation of Ulysses, which the Trojans are inclined to believe in large part because they know Odysseus is a scoundrel. So a part of the reason that the Greeks decided to leave Troy, according to Sinon, has to do with this theft of the Palladium. Again, an event which Odysseus took part in. So Odysseus and Diomedes snuck into the city at one point. They invaded a temple of Athena/Minerva, they killed the guards, and then they stole the sacred statue. The Trojans think that this is sacrilege, but what they do not know is that Priam's son Helenus had defected from Troy, and he gave the Greeks a prophecy telling them that Troy could not be taken unless the Palladium were stolen first. So, in effect, this was the fulfillment of an oracle which the Greeks had received and not a sacrilegious violation. But the Trojans don't know that. And as a side note and a further illustration of Odysseus' character, in some accounts of this, Odysseus is claimed to have wanted to seize all of the glory for himself, and to that end, he planned to kill Diomedes once they had dispatched all of these guards. Diomedes noticed the glinting of the moonlight off of Odysseus' sword, told him to, stop being such a scoundrel, he ties his hands and makes Odysseus walk in front of him, but otherwise bears him no ill will. He doesn't try to have Odysseus tried or executed, and indeed, Diomedes was a much stronger warrior than Odysseus. He really could have just killed Odysseus at that time. This is why Odysseus had to stab Diomedes in the back if he were going to do it. In any event, the Trojans believe this story, and their belief is confirmed when suddenly some sea serpents arise and strangle Laocoon and his children. You might remember that this scene is described in particular detail in the book. So Laocoon and his children are strangled, and it's thought to be a clear message from Athena that Laocoon has offended against the gods, and that this is indeed an object which is sacred to Athena/Minerva. So at that point, the Trojans decide to bring the horse into the gates, but this is not without being attended by another evil omen, because as they're trying to pull it into the gates, it gets stuck 4 times, which is already a bad omen, getting stuck 4 times over the threshold. And then it's also noted that they can hear the weapons clanging within, but they had been seized at this point by a certain religious madness. So they bring the horse in, and then they get really hammered because they're celebrating, and then they all go to sleep. At this point, Sinon lets the Greeks out. They open the gates. The rest of the Greeks sail back from Tenedos and invade the city. And you can more or less imagine that because all the Trojans are either asleep, drunk, or in some other way totally disarmed, it ends up being more or less a massacre rather than an outright battle. Aeneas himself at the time was asleep, and suddenly in his sleep appears Hector. And Aeneas describes that Hector looks rather gruesome and grisly, and this is in large part because you may remember that Hector's corpse was degraded by Achilles following his death. Hector was dragged around the walls of Troy several times behind Achilles' chariot. So Hector urges Aeneas to wake up, to grab the Penates and the sacred fire of Vesta, and to hurry up and get out of the city. And at this point, he notes that if arms were of any use, if indeed it were possible to defend Troy, then Hector would have done it, but the fact that he is appearing as a ghost indicates that he was not successful in that. So Aeneas gets up and he gets out of there with a band of guys. Now, they have a couple of misadventures along the way, none of them particularly memorable. At one point, they run into some Greeks and steal their arms. They do, at one point, see Cassandra, one of Priam's daughters, being taken from Athena's shrine by Ajax. Now, this hints back at the allusion that you have early in book 1 to the anger of Athena toward Ajax for raping Cassandra. Note here, this vase painting makes it clear that this was not it was not just that Ajax had violated Cassandra, but he had done so in the most irreligious of ways when she was supplicating Athena for protection. And so you might remember that Athena destroys most of the Greek fleet as a result of Ajax's actions alone. So eventually, Aeneas and his men find themselves upon a rooftop where they can look down at Priam and his wife Hecuba, and some of the slaughter that's being inflicted by Pyrrhus/Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles. Now, Neoptolemus/Pyrrhus, he kills Priam's son in front of him, and at that point, Priam suggests that Neoptolemus/Pyrrhus is a monster, and that his father Achilles was capable of showing mercy to an old man. And at that point, Pyrrhus tells Priam that he could go ahead and tell that to his dad himself in hell, and then he stabs him to death. At this point, Aeneas is horrified, but he decides he needs to get out of there, and as they're going away, he catches sight of Helen. And he has already witnessed a substantial amount of horrors, and most of them he thinks have been brought about by Helen herself, and so he decides that he is going to kill her. Then he wavers a little bit because he thinks that perhaps it's not right, but then he decides, after all, that it's probably a good idea to go ahead and kill her, even though there's not really any glory in it. There will be some honor to his name that he extinguished a crime against humanity by eliminating her existence. But you might remember that Aphrodite has something of a soft spot for Helen, so she descends from the heavens and appears to Aeneas in her regular form. He notes specifically that she appears as she does to the gods, and tells him that Helen's not to blame, that he should leave her alone, and instead think about his father Anchises and his wife Creusa, and his son Iulus/Ascanius. So she tells him to go back home, get his family, and all of that, which he does. He goes to the house of Anchises, his father, and Anchises tells him that he doesn't even want to live anymore. He says, look, just let me die here. It's not even worth going on. If I wanted to live through my old age, I would have done it here in Troy, but since the city's going to be destroyed, I might as well let myself get murdered. Aeneas doesn't really take this. Anchises himself was not able to walk at the time, and so Aeneas carries him on his shoulder. Note carefully that this is an example of Aeneas's pietas, his piety, or his reverence. So eventually, Aeneas, Anchises, Creusa, and Iulus/Ascanius are all on their merry way to get away from Troy. But at some point, Aeneas apparently moves a little bit too fast in his eagerness to flee the city, and he notices when he looks back that his wife is nowhere to be seen. He then entrusts his father and his son to some of the other Trojans and tells them to go on ahead. He goes back to look for his wife, can't find her anywhere, thinks that someone must have snatched her, and then conveniently, this is an absurd poetic fiction, but conveniently, it turns out that she has already died, but has, in some mysterious way, already been semi-deified. She ascends to some kind of divine state, appears to him as a ghost, and tells him that she's living a blessed life now, and that he should go on and achieve all of the great things that fate has in store for him, and not even think about her anymore. So, at this point, Aeneas more or less complies with this advice. He scoots his way on out of there, and he and the other Trojans who are with him head for the mountains. Note that this poetic fiction of Creusa dying and telling Aeneas to go on ahead is a way of resolving the fact that he initially had a wife with the tradition that he married again when he arrived in Italy and he had children with Lavinia there. Um, and you might also note that it serves Virgil's poetic purpose because he needs Aeneas to have a love affair with Dido, not because that was originally a part of the mythic tradition, it was not, but rather because Virgil needs that to explain the origins of the hatred between the Carthaginians or the Phoenicians more broadly and the Romans. All right, and that's more or less book 2 in a nutshell. Book 3 picks up after they've left off and relates Aeneas's journeys at sea, and I'll make that video soon enough.